commence. We have a wonderful panel on international trade, and it's a pleasure to welcome all of you to this distinguished group. And Gordon Goldstein, partner at Silverlake Partners and in charge of public policy, is going to, and a famous Columbia graduate, is going to lead this discussion. Thank you, Gordon, for your leadership around this discussion.
Thank you, Merritt. It's fitting that we're following Brad Smith and his insightful comments on data localization and trends in digital trade. That's the theme of our discussion this afternoon: trade, internet governance, and cross-border data flows. A note about our panel: we have lost two of our Tims. We've lost Tim Murphy and Tim Reif for logistical complications, but as in life, when one door closes, another door opens, and I'm pleased to welcome Anupam Chander to the panel this afternoon. Anupam is a professor at the University of California, Davis, their law school. He is a preeminent expert on data localization. I found in my own writing a year ago when I was doing something for The Atlantic, I was looking for the ideal scholarly piece that would substantiate this trend of data localization, and a colleague from Google said, I can tell you exactly where to go and who wrote it. And so we're delighted that he's agreed to step in and to talk on this theme. We have three other additional experts: Susan Chalmers, Victoria Espinel, and Nick Ashton-Hart. You have their bios, so I won't waste time recapitulating their very impressive careers. As you can tell, they are truly expert on these issues, which we will dig into according to a four-part structure. Our goal in this conversation is to first talk about the centrality of cross-border data flows for the digital economy, what they are and why they matter. Two, we want to establish the facts around the rising pattern of data localization, what some call data protectionism, and why that matters. And then three, we're going to pivot to Europe, talk about the very dynamic situation there with respect to digital trade, including but not limited to Google and the action that the European Commission is taking against one of the dominant tech players in the world. And then finally, if there's time, I'd like to talk about China, which poses its own set of distinct and unique challenges for digital trade. So let's begin, if we could, by just level setting, as they say, on the scope of the global internet economy. As you all know, there are 3 billion people connected to the network. 500 million people join every day. The internet economy, if it were a country, would be the fourth largest in the world, behind the United States, China, and Japan. The McKinsey Global Institute has tabulated or calculated that the trans-border flow of goods, services, and investments reached $26 trillion in 2012, and they project that that number will triple by 2025. And if that were not staggering enough, Cisco has done a market analysis on the potential economic impact of the so-called Internet of Things. They project that that will eventually be a $14 trillion economy. So as we look ahead, I'd like to begin by asking Nick. We look at this vast transfer of economic activity to the internet. Talk to us, if you could, about the difference of what we talk about as B2C and B2B, and where are the primary transborder data flows coming, and why are they so important to the digital economy?
Sure, and firstly, thank you all for coming to the trade session instead of the perhaps more sexy free expression session in the other room. I'm sure we'll do our best to be as exciting as they are. I would say that this is one of the great tragedies of the discussion of data flows, is that there's an almost automatic connection, certainly in Geneva amongst the delegates there, especially the trade delegates. There's an almost immediate connection between data flows and business to consumer services, the big search engines, social media, and the like. Whereas the reality is more than 70% of trade that relates to the digital economy is actually, the benefits actually go to traditional industries. And why this is a tragedy is because those are the industries that every country absolutely has. Everyone does not have a Google or a Facebook, and yet trade policy is being weighted towards a public debate which is focused on the minority, the economic minority of what the opportunity in digital trade. To give you an idea of how different this is than the narrative that we see, is in the last couple of years, services industries worldwide became the largest employers compared to manufacturing, which has something like 10%. For services employment, it's over 40% and rapidly growing towards 50%, and this is globally. So, and services are tradable fundamentally because the internet has made them tradable, to the point where something like 1/3 of all products are actually a service. Well, this is unimaginable. Without data flows, all of that goes back to the way it was, really. I think you can compare the idea that localizing data or trying to keep information within your country or keep foreign information out of your country. I mean, I think the nearest corollary is sort of the beggar thy neighbor policies of the 30s, where people actually thought protectionism would save them from the Great Depression and instead made it vastly worse. And this is really, I think, the way to persuade policymakers of the value of open networks is really to make these arguments, because none of them want to cripple their own local businesses. None of them want to lose the value that the internet presents for SMEs. There's very clear information that the SMEs that export are vastly more successful than those that don't. New businesses that export using the internet survive much longer. And SMEs are, of course, upwards of 80% of most economies' activities. So I think we can make the argument for an open internet. The irony is if you make the argument for the business-to-business internet, you have also made it for the business-to-consumer. There are issues, of course, of personal information and the like, but then it becomes a challenge to be solved, rather than companies to be kept out because they're foreign or competition to be avoided. Instead, it becomes an opportunity for all parts of your economy to leverage technology as a multiplier.
Victoria, can we assume that you see the B2B component of the internet economy as Nick does?
So I think you made a great point, and I think it's one that people really haven't taken on board for whatever combination of reasons, and I might elaborate a little bit what I imagine those combination of reasons to be. But yes, that is exactly the same. One of the things that I talk about when I talk about the data localization, the data flows issue, is how much of the information that's valuable, and not just commercially valuable, but valuable in terms of bringing benefits to society, is not the personal information, which really draws all of the attention. And there's some very legitimate reasons why it does draw attention, and those issues need to be addressed. But the debate has really focused on that as if that is the vast majority of the data that needs to flow around the world in order for the global economy to work, and that's simply not true. So yes, so that was a long way of saying yes. I'll say I was a trade negotiator myself for many years, which is, in my opinion, is one of the best jobs that you can possibly have. And I think you're completely right that you need to make the economic arguments to governments around the world, and they need to understand that. But there's also reality that trade policy is driven by politics, and there are some political realities out there being driven by things like the revelations about NSA and about the legitimate concerns about privacy. And so I would say those also need to be addressed. You can debate about whether or not there's certainly, and I think we'll have a chance to talk about some of these, market access barriers we see going up around the world, and you can debate what the motivation is behind those market access barriers. But regardless, frankly, of the motivation, the issues that are out there with respect to privacy, including, in our own U.S. domestic legal system here at home, clearly have to be addressed. At the same time, I wish there were more voices out there making the point about the economics, because that is very much lost in the debate that we're having right now, and it's an incredibly important point.
This provides us an elegant opportunity to pivot to Anupam, who I think has written the definitive scholarly study on the prevalence of data localization. In his work, he and a co-author have methodically and systematically literally surveyed the world and looked at the pattern of what is variously referred to as data localization, data nationalism, data protectionism. And you would be shocked to see the breadth of that pattern. It encompasses countries ranging from Australia, France, and South Korea to India, Indonesia, Kazakhstan, and Vietnam. And I'm going to introduce this question to you, Anupam, with a quote from your article, where you say that anxieties over surveillance are justifying governmental measures that break apart the World Wide Web, that you wrote with with your co-author. As a result, you say, the era of a global internet may be passing.
So thank you very much, and thank you to Dean Jano and to Gordon for the invitation to participate. I'm sure the two Tims would have been a much better deal, so I'm sorry about the...
One Anupam equals two Tims.
So I think, in fact, that there is a kind of perfect storm brewing, which is the Snowden revelations on one hand, which suggest that the U.S. government is surveilling the world, and as Nick, you said yesterday in another conversation, hoovering up information. And at the same time, we see the fact that the U.S. companies have come to largely dominate the internet space. So that combination of facts on the ground leads to a clear policy proposal, which is, if we force companies to use information that is only going to be stored within a particular country, well, we simultaneously help domestic enterprise, we diminish U.S. Company dominance, and protect information from the eyes of the NSA, right? That's the logic behind much of what you see in the world today. And it's a kind of irresistible logic understood at that level. Now, I think the reality, of course, is very different. First and foremost, the U.S. government is actually surveilling all across the world. It's not limiting its surveillance to the United States. And it's the U.S. Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act with no constraints on how it surveils across the world. So, in fact, there's a huge amount of surveillance apparatus across the world. But more importantly, it doesn't have the economic benefits that the governments think it does. Creating local server farms employs very few people. These are, these server farms are computers, large arrays of computers. And the irony of it all is that the computers could easily be American computers. And so there are American companies which are at the leading edge of providing servers to the world. So in fact, a lot of American companies love data localization because it gives them the opportunity to sell more stuff to the world, right? So it doesn't have the economic impact that is perceived. In fact, as Nick pointed out, it makes it harder for companies to build on what exists in the world, right? So one of the examples I use, and my co-author is Win Lei, is a Vietnamese programmer who in 2013 had the #1 best-selling app on the Apple Store. And how is that possible? Well, he leveraged a kind of global payments network, a global advertising network, a global distribution platform, with no thought to where the information was going to be residing with respect, you've got all kinds of payment details that are passing through the world. You've got all kinds of account credentials for download. The game, of course, that you know is Flappy Bird, right? All this incredible leveraging of global networks, a variety of global networks, and that kind of free information flow is key to the global economy. It's key to enabling Vietnam and small Vietnamese programmers to compete at a global level. It's key to enabling companies all across the world to scale up and hope to provide services across the world. If they are forced, so one of the proposals in Nigeria, one of the laws in Nigeria says that if you're setting up an ICT company, you have to use the .Nigeria domain. So, that itself signals that you are not going to be sending stuff to the world, right? Their goal is, we've got a Nigerian market, let's just build for Nigeria. Well, there's no reason to expect that Nigerians can't build for the world. So that's what I would suggest, that we've got a perfect storm brewing, but it doesn't actually accomplish the public policy goals that the governments think it does.
In a moment, we're going to pivot to Europe, but before we do, Susan, I wanted to give you a chance to opine on this. You're a student and observer of the regulatory regime as it applies in different state governments and globally. What do you see as the primary drivers to this phenomenon?
Well, I just following upon what Anupam said, I think that it's interesting to see the ways in which, if I might offer a counter view, because I used to work for a country code top-level domain as their policy lead. So that was .NZ at Internet New Zealand. And I think that there is something to be said for the encouragement of the use of local CCTLDs and the way that they can help build up the local economy, which I think sometimes that gets lost within the discussion on localization, because when you do locate server farms within a country, while it may not, in terms of hardware, in terms of those employed, be largely contributory to the local economy, what it does do is it encourages the traffic to stay local, and it also helps discourage tromboning of traffic. For example, if you send traffic offshore and you see it travel through a number of different networks to get back to the same locality. So I think that policies encouraging the use of CCTLDs and localization in that regard can be beneficial to the development of the local internet industry.
Thank you for that. Let's turn to Europe. Everyone's been reading the headlines about Google. The European Commission has registered a formal legal complaint. Google is being challenged for its market dominance. The initial complaint focuses on the comparison shopping function, but the Commission has also indicated its intention to investigate the role of the Android operating system in the European Union countries. I'm going to ask Victoria to help us penetrate to the essence of this. This type of action was launched against Microsoft years ago. They spent years fighting it. Ultimately, they spent almost $3 billion settling it. What direction is this thing going? And is it going to be a replay of the Microsoft experience?
So first of all, I will apologize for this, but I'm going to do it anyway. I'm going to be a rogue panelist, and I'm going to make one more global comment before we pivot to Europe, because I think it's really important in the context of data flows just to make an observation and a pitch for the multilateral discussions that are going on right now, the TPP negotiations. So one thing that's really kind of extraordinary to me as a trade negotiator, and one of the things I think is really exacerbating this issue, is that there are no global trade rules on data flows right now. And if the Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiations are concluded, that will be the first time there are any international trade rules on data. And it's I think in some ways it's a really, assuming it gets successfully concluded, it's a really exciting moment for that. It's sort of like the Uruguay round in the late 80s when people were talking about putting intellectual property in the trade rules for the first time because some countries realized that that was going to be an enormous driver of the global economy and there needed to be trade rules to put parameters around that. That was really prescient, but it was very controversial at the time as whether or not intellectual property should be part of trade. And I think data, we're kind of at that same moment. We're clearly at the beginning of a real revolution in terms of the global economy. And there's a opportunity to be seized to put some parameters around trade rules to encourage the free flow, but also understanding that there will be national security exceptions and what the standards for those should be. So I think there's a real opportunity, and hopefully TPP and other trade negotiations as they move forward will take advantage of that. Because I think that's a fundamental lack in the international system right now that is allowing some of these policies that we've talked about to move forward. But then to pivot into Europe, where there's also trade negotiations with the United States going on that also I think could helpfully address some of these issues. I think I think there's a real concern inside of Europe, and we see it in other countries as well, that they have somehow missed out on part of the global economy, and that's people have talked here. In fact, David Kirkpatrick sort of mentioned the techno-imperialism and the sense that the United States has really dominated in this area. And it is true that U.S. companies are at the forefront of this. I think some of what we are seeing in Europe right now with respect to Google, and I don't want to speak on their behalf, but with respect to sort of tech policy in general, is driven by the view that erecting barriers or making it more difficult for companies to operate is going to give an advantage to European industry. I want to be clear that I don't think that view is shared by European policymakers across the board. In fact, I think there are voices inside the European Commission and inside of national governments that would argue very much the opposite, that having a Europe that is open to competition and having a Europe that's doing all that it can to promote digital innovation inside of Europe while not keeping other companies out is the way to go. But I think there is a concern about sort of U.S. tech hegemony, and I think that is one of the reasons we're seeing some of European policy move in the direction that it has. It'll be really interesting to see what the digital single market strategy does, how the relatively high level strategy is put out, how that's actually implemented, and it'll be interesting to see how that moves forward. I think there's a real opportunity there to try to address some of these issues in a more positive way. It's also, there are things laid out in the strategy that could potentially take a more negative turn.
I want to follow up on this theme of the resentment of American hegemony in the global tech economy. In preparing for this discussion, I came across the following quote from The Economist in talking about this reaction to the dominance of American technology companies, which in Europe I believe are referred to as GAFA, Google, Apple, Facebook, and Amazon. The Economist wrote, Europe is belatedly discovering its failure to develop many of the platforms underpinning the online economy. Much of the world's digital territory has in effect been ceded to America without a fight. Is that a fair characterization of sentiment in Europe, Nick?
If it is, it's breathtakingly wrong-headed. Again, this is an economic minority. Whether or not it's true that Europe does not have good search engines or social media, Europe's industrial champions are at the absolute forefront of integrating internet-driven services into their products. Volvo actually allows you to buy a truck, which you can buy extra horsepower for one journey on that truck, based literally online. And that's why people buy those trucks for a lot of commercial applications in many countries around the world. This is why Volvo's heavy truck, that section of their company is spectacularly successful. We are having a discussion about European competitiveness, which has completely lost track of the fact that Europe is at the absolute forefront of competitiveness in all kinds of sectors, if you look at the internet in terms of the services that are built into physical goods. And yet we're proposing to make rules driven entirely by really motivations that are unworthy of Europeans, to be honest. We should not be trying to find ways to protect ourselves from other people in one particular segment. We should say, well, we're greatly successful in so many others, we just need to focus on this particular one, rather than this digital protectionist thing. However, I will say that I think there is a great gulf in understanding of how the privacy discussion is viewed across the Atlantic. I think there's a perception that people actually both see each other as wanting to protect privacy in the same fundamental ways, which I'm not sure is true, but there's certainly a big gulf. And I think that's greatly complicating it, but again, in a completely bizarre way, because there's discussions of the obligations of companies related to privacy, but there's almost no discussion of the fact that Europe's privacy regulations almost completely exempt all governments from any of the same conditions that companies must live up to the point that the UK National Health Service sold the hospital records of 48 million British people, myself included, to the insurance industry, and nobody lost their job, nobody went to court, there were no screaming headlines, it was a small story, it got bumped up a little bit, but it was a relatively small story. So even in Europe, we have a completely, this is like Alice in Wonderland, the debate that we have about industrial policy in the online world. Completely crazy. And it's like, I have a feeling we're going to look back in 20 years and going, what were those people smoking? That they thought this had any resemblance to their interests.
Anupam, I'm going to ask you to help us drill down a bit on Europe, in particular, the question of Germany. Much of the animus directed at the United States following the Snowden revelations came from Germany, and there was an immediate discussion about creating sort of a cloud-based European version of the internet, which was a startling break with the prior rhetoric of the globalism of the internet. Give us a sense, Anupam, of the state of play about regulation in Germany and who you think the leading voices are driving their approach to cloud computing and data localization.
Sure. So I think that the European failure in this area has been largely self-inflicted. Just stepping back in this context. Let me tell you about a case arising out of Sweden about a decade ago, in the early days of these internet companies. A woman taking a data processing course puts up a web page, and she writes on the web page something about each of her fellow parishioners who are preparing for some activity in her church. Along the way, she writes that one of them has a broken foot. For this, she is criminally prosecuted in Sweden, okay? Which tells you a couple things. The first of which is clearly Sweden has no real lawbreakers. Secondly, it tells you about the law and how suffocating it is, right? So the Swedish court then certifies this question to the European Court of Justice. So this goes to the highest court within the European Union system. And the case is called Bodil Lindqvist, if any of the students here want to look it up. The European Court of Justice is asked to opine on whether or not what she has done has violated European data protection law. How might it have violated the law? Well, she published information using automated means because a web page has an automated server system, okay? As you can imagine how a web page works, there's not a human being that serves up your information every time you request it. It's done by computer and therefore automated. And she had done so without the consent of the data subjects. And the European Court of Justice read this and said, yes, in fact, she's violated the European data protection rules. So imagine in that context, if you're an entrepreneur, where do you build a social enterprise on the internet? Do you choose to build it in a country or in a continent that declares the sharing of information about others without their consent for that precise sharing to be illegal and criminally sanctionable? So luckily, it's just a penalty. She doesn't go to jail, but still, it's a remarkable self-inflicted wound. And so this leads to the rise of American companies that fill this void created within Europe itself. And I think there's a lot of things that one can say in this vein about European law that proved to be very inhospitable to domestic enterprise, to domestic innovation. And I think that's true even of the right to be forgotten, to add to the controversy here. Google actually has the wherewithal to look at I think it's 1 million roughly requests. Very few companies have that wherewithal to look at, to individually review 1 million requests. Right? Even Columbia University, with all its might, would not be able to very readily process 1 million requests. And Dean Jano is nodding. So it's this is the kind of thing that makes it hard to create innovation if you have these kinds of regulations. And so you have to think about. Yes, it's easy to see that you want to stick it to Google or stick it to GAFA. Is that what you said? Stick it to GAFA, but are you unintentionally sticking it to your own companies? Now, Gordon, you asked about Germany and what's going on. Germany, look, the U.S. really annoyed the Germans, and I think surveilling Angela Merkel's cell phone, which is a Nokia. Yes, it was outrageous. So I'm not here defending American governments, and I'm not from the USTR, so I'm not one of the TIMs. It's outrageous, and I think we Americans should be outraged, and the Germans should be outraged. I think we should all be outraged, and I think these are outrageous acts. And Dilma Rousseff is similarly outraged at this, and she said when it was determined that Petrobras was one of the companies that was being surveilled by the NSA, she said, Petrobras is not a terrorist organization. And so, but from the United States angle, by the way, it's national security because energy. So energy companies are fair game for our national security surveillance apparatus, right? So there's a lot of reasons to be very upset. But there's also corporate interests at stake here. Deutsche Telekom was very keen on trying to get more routing through its networks. And Deutsche Telekom has a very interesting, there are others who are much more expert in the room here on peering arrangements, but Deutsche Telekom doesn't have the same reciprocal no-fee peering arrangements with other providers. And so it is one of the countries in which you can be a German communicating with a German, but it might be routed outside the country to get to the German, partly because of the Deutsche Telekom owns much of the networks. It might be a lot cheaper to route it outside the country and bring it back in. So one way to force the information to stay on corporate networks, particular enterprises, is to build a law to send the information in. I'm all for Deutsche Telekom saying, we have the most secure network in the world. We are the best. We're so much better than Google. We're so much better than Facebook. Send it through us. We're so much better than Amazon. We're so much better than L3 or whatever the other backbone providers are in the United States. Send it through us. I think that's exactly what they should be doing. They should be saying, we've got the best global network. Route your traffic through us. But I'm not for government policies that say you can only choose a local provider with the local hardware. That, in fact, undermines security. It undermines privacy. The fact of reducing competition reduces the quality of service ultimately in the long run. That's the history of protectionism around the world, and it's clear that it doesn't actually accomplish the goals that you hope that it does.
Susan, you're our expert on this panel on internet governance, and I have a question about how that's playing out, the debate about the future of internet governance in Europe as it relates to trade. I'd like to posit the question in the following way. In December 2012, there was a major global conference called the WICIT, the World Conference on International Telecommunication. A number of the delegates to the American team are here today at this conference. The conference ended in sharp discord. The United States indicated that we would not sign the treaty that was produced from those 2 weeks of deliberations. And after some tense negotiations, it became clear that all of the EU countries would follow the United States and also not sign the ITRs. That seemed to be a high watermark for the solidarity of the United States and Europe on the question of internet governance. And then the Snowden revelations came, and that seemed to really destabilize the relationship. What is the state of play, from your perspective, in Europe on the future of internet governance as it relates to the issues we've been talking about here and trade? Is there now a greater disparity of common principles between the United States and Europe? Is the Google situation, the Commission's decision to go after Google and perhaps others following Google, is that a foreshadowing of a difference on how we think about internet governance?
I don't think so. I think that for all intents and purposes, you do see a general alignment in support of the multi-stakeholder model between the U.S. and Europe, and I think that's a very sturdy alignment of views at this point. In terms of the state of play, the digital single market strategy that was just released, I think, can give us a bit of an indication as to where some of these problems might be addressed, some of these internet governance and policy issues, and how they may be treated going forward. And also, and Victoria had mentioned the state of play of the trade agreements in Europe. So I think that's also another interesting question if you're looking at the relationship between the United States and other countries or different regions, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, for example, and the ways in which these countries aren't necessarily, or these trade agreements aren't necessarily connecting within the internet governance realm. It feels like the trade realm, the traditional realm, feels a bit separate and distinguished and different than the fora in which internet governance discussions are held. So I think that if there's one point I think that is worth making is that if you have these two very different models, these two very different spheres, and they're converging on certain points within the trade and the internet governance, and they're being discussed in different fora, I think that there is a lost opportunity for people, especially other stakeholders, to be able to address some of the issues therein. And I guess one specific example of where these two spheres are converging but people are talking across each other would be, again, policies for CCTLD operators. So if, for example, in trade agreements, there are provisions that would request that CCTLD operators provide policies for domain name disputes. Domain name disputes and CCTLD policies are largely discussed within the province of ICANN in this internet governance sphere, which is a different kind of consultation model where you have stakeholders on equal footing coming together to develop policies based on consensus. And you see this is a very different process and model than we have in the trade sphere. So I think I think there's something to be said for coordinating these discussions, or at least making CCTLD operators aware of the fact that these policies are being developed through trade mechanisms so that people aren't talking across each other. So yeah, I think that basically the US and Europe and a number of different countries find alignment on the basic internet governance issues and the multi-stakeholder model. But when you get down into the finer points, and especially on this point of trade, I think that this conversation needs to be held within the same room, as it were.
Thank you for that. Let's move, with a few minutes left, let's move to the question of China. And let me just set the stage. We're all aware of the success of the so-called Great Firewall in China that keeps information in and allows the state to keep information out concurrently. We've all read recently about the so-called Great Cannon, which is one of the first instances we know of the Chinese trying to project beyond China's territorial borders to control content flows into China. And we're all aware of the recent directive that was floated by Chinese regulators that would require American technology companies to provide source code, encryption keys, and backdoors as a requirement to participate in the Chinese market. Victoria, I imagine this is an issue that you've devoted some time to analyzing. What's going on here?
Yes, I've devoted some time thinking about it. So, you mentioned the banking regulations. There's sort of just a step back from that moment. There's a broader China cybersecurity review going on right now, and sort of one of the first manifestations of that are the regulations that you mentioned, which said that providers, including U.S. IT providers to the banking sector, have to comply with certain rules, which we find deeply problematic, including disclosure of source code and encryption backdoors into the technology, and there's some other aspects as well. There is around the same time a draft counterterrorism law that China put forward, which has many of the same components. So it's a different set of regulations, focused on a different sector, but it has many of the same encryption and disclosure of source code problems with it. And inside this broader cybersecurity view, it's possible that China could move beyond, in fact, that was the intention, and move beyond the financial services sector into other sectors as well. And I think these are, we can, if you want, I can sort of elaborate on at least our understanding of what the status is of the
what is
regulations.
The status? Because it's in abeyance, as I understand, but it hasn't been withdrawn?
Yes, that's exactly. It's in April, the government announced on the banking regulations that they would be suspended, but they've not yet been terminated. There's supposed to be a revision that's going to be announced soon, so we'll see what that says. And the counterterrorism laws is sort of in a somewhat similar situation. It was moving through the Chinese legislative process. The sort of final hearing, effectively passage of it, was supposed to happen in March, has not happened for whatever combinations of reasons, potentially because the United States government, up to the level President Obama has been raising his concerns with this, but it is sort of in abeyance, and it's unclear what the next steps are going to be. So those are two deeply concerning policy steps, but I think they are sort of, I would say, symptomatic or examples of larger sort of policy directions that we find concerning, that I think are sort of manifestations of a lot of the things that we've been talking about on this panel. And I would also say, we've talked a lot about the economic impact, and that is very, very important. But another way that data localization or data retention can be used by governments is either to to make it easier to encroach on the privacy of their own citizens, or to make it easier to put, censorship or restrictions on free speech inside their own governments. And that is, I would say, as problematic as the economic consequences of some of these policies.
Do you have a point of view on this?
Yeah, well, I can tell you, I spend a lot of time with, it's my job to spend time with the general missions in Geneva and the trade missions in Geneva. And I think what we are seeing is a mirroring. Huawei is blocked in the US. Cisco went from 60 products on the approved list and in 1 year had 0 for state-owned enterprises and for the government. And the banking regulations. There is a mirroring of policies. It's clever in its own way by China, but it's escalating. It's not actually in anyone's interest to continue down this path. And I worry that if this continues, other countries will be incentivized to behave in a similar way. And I know from speaking to trade policymakers, they are deeply worried because the trade system is designed to solve problems related to all exceptions in trade rules except the national security exception. Because everyone knows if you go to the dispute settlement system of the WTO with a national security case, the DSU will lose regardless of who loses the case. Because the country that loses that dispute will say, I don't care what you say, I'm not going to comply with this because my national security needs are more important than my treaty obligations. And so I think we have to find a way, maybe the engineers of the world can help by saying, you know what, we all need more trust in the code that's in products. We need some kind of way where there is sort of an open source mentality to code, yet somehow preserving the proprietary parts of code that companies don't want to open up. I don't know that there's a magic solution, there probably isn't, but I think we should all see a very serious incentive to finding a way out of this, because this is not escalating in a direction that is healthy for anyone. A rules-based trading system is a profound benefit to a peaceful world. People who have interdependent trading relationships tend not to go to war with one another, to be very blunt about it. And so not only do we have profound economic losses to make, this is like poking each other in the eye. Everybody goes blind, but that doesn't solve any problems. And I've never seen, in 20 years of participating in UN process, almost 30, I have never seen people more genuinely concerned than they are now over this kind of dispute and it getting out of hand, because there doesn't seem to be any break on the behavior on anyone's side.
Suzanne, you had something you wanted to contribute here?
I just wanted to recognize what Nick was saying. In New Zealand, where I live, we had just passed legislation that, for all intents and purposes, was designed to be able to vet the hardware or changes to the network that ISPs were making. And it really did feel like a rushed response. And it really did feel like a rushed response to exclude Huawei from being able to participate within the local internet infrastructure or be used. But I think it's important, on that note, I think it's important to observe that by creating these types of regulations, which are spurred by these fears or these kind of mirrorings or pokings, they have flow-on effects, because the regulatory compliance for a number of ISPs was so great, or a number of even research institutions, that what happened was there was groundbreaking research being done on software-defined networking within New Zealand. But due to the compliance costs of this new legislation to report all of the anticipated changes in hardware or in the design of the network to the government, to have the government come back and vet and say it was okay. This is the Telecommunications Interception Capability and Security Act in New Zealand, if anybody's interested. We actually saw that research move offshore, which is a huge loss for New Zealand, because if we're talking about trade, where New Zealand used to have refrigerated shipping. It would export lamb. That was amazing, and it took a few weeks. Now we can export software in 2 seconds to the rest of the world. And so if you have we're not able to take advantage of these opportunities because of kind of reactionary legislation, then I think that's a big concern.
We have time for two brief comments. Why don't you go, Victoria, and then Anupam, you ate the last word on China and the future of its internet economy.
So just following on from what my co-panelists have said, I think you can look at any particular regulation or any particular policy, as I said at the beginning, and you can debate what the motivation for the government was. And was that industrial economic policy? Was that protectionism? Was that concerns about security? And in some way, but I think the reality is there are real national security and protection of their citizen issues that governments around the world are grappling with. Every government around the world is grappling with that, including our own. So, and I think governments are unclear of what the best way forward is in a world that is as interconnected as ours is today. And there are, we have views on which government policies we would favor over others, but I think what is absolutely clear is that it's not going to be up to any one country. And since I'm American, I'll just, from the point of view of the United States, if the United States comes up with what it thinks is the correct way for surveillance and for broader law enforcement and government access to data to work within our own system of due process and civil liberties, and then tries to go to other governments of the world and say, this is the way that should work, that is doomed to failure. So while I would in no way minimize the difficulty of this initiative, I think it's absolutely imperative the United States government and some governments around the world, and it probably will not be possible at the outset to bring every government into that country. I do think there has to be some sort of commonality of goal there, but to have the United States and as many governments as possible working together cooperatively to come up with what is the right way to approach the spectrum between national security and privacy, and what are policies that you can put in place to protect your citizens while also protecting their privacy. I think that has to be an international discussion. We absolutely need norms around that, but it needs to be, as difficult as it will be, that absolutely needs to be a discussion that's happening in an international context.
So just to pick up on Victoria's comment and also pick up on Susan and Nick's, I think the one important thing for governments to understand is that if they act, they should act in a way that is universalizable. That is, that other governments might be able to do the same thing, right? So if the United States starts to do things like put in backdoors into encryption software and demands those, China is going to demand those. And so, or if China does this, then the United States will do this, et cetera, et cetera. And to borrow Nick's term from earlier, this is a kind of ultimately a beggar thy neighbor policy. It's the world exactly contrary to the nature of the internet, which is designed to promote internet flows, so the sharing of information across borders. And so the example that Brad Smith gave us at lunch, right after lunch, which was Alibaba building out data infrastructures in the United States, well, that is because the Great Firewall of China that Gordon referenced is a way to keep American companies out, but it might also have the unintended consequence of keeping Chinese companies in. Because if you are afraid that your information is to be hoovered up by the Chinese government, you may not trust your information to Chinese enterprises operating outside China. So Alibaba then is trying to respond clearly to say, look, your information is stored in the United States, and it won't be sucked up by the Chinese government. So all these consequences, all the kind of the blowback that's going to happen if governments aren't more thoughtful and don't act in a way to recognize that we're living in a kind of shared community, and action by one government is going to lead to counter-reaction by other governments.
I regret that on that thoughtfully expressed but foreboding note, we will probably have to conclude. This has been a terrific discussion. Thank you for your expertise. Everyone, please join me in thanking our experts.